for pretty much all disciplines. We all assign readings. And I want to make something clear really quick is that when we use the word reading, we're using that as a catch-all for any kind of text you might assign students to engage with. So yes, all the traditional print texts, books, articles, essays, but also film, podcast episodes, online text, anything that students will be engaging with as part of the course material. I'm pretty sure everything we're going to show you applies equally to any kind of assigned text. So we're going to,
Got it.
yeah, can you?
No, you have.
I think you.
Oh, do I have to do it? Oh. Ah, if I could see it, I would. Oh, or not. There we go.
Yeah.
No, no,
I'm not leaving that. Don't worry. I'm not.
It's so perilous.
The Marx Brothers talk about reading discussions. Okay. This is. Okay. I want you all to reflect on what just happened. No. Okay. So our outcomes for this session are to give you some chance to reflect on your own discussion practices in your class, whatever forms those might take. Evaluate various strategies and select some appropriate for your own classrooms. We're going to share a few with you with some variations that you could adapt. And hopefully, I don't know about you, but when I go to any kind of conference, I'm always happiest when I leave a session with at least one specific concrete thing I can do in my classes in the near future. And so we're hoping you'll have at least one thing, if not multiple things, you can practice this spring. And so we're going to start by turning it over to you. Take a few moments. We'd like you to jot some thoughts about these prompts. And again, like I tell my students when I have us do this, you're not writing an essay, just jot some bullet points. You can use your own personal code, whatever will help you just get some ideas into a solid form. So think about the times you've had reading-based discussions in your classes that just went really well. You left the classroom thinking, yes, this is why I do it. Why were they so good? And then flip it and think about those times when you had a reading-based discussion and you walked out of the room thinking, maybe I should get my real estate license after all. Why did you think they went so badly? What made them frustrating or less effective? So take a few to think about that. It's going to bother me until I get rid of it. Yeah. Maybe another minute or so. Get some thoughts down. Okay, and what we're going to do next is sort of split between those of us in the room and those of us on the Zoom to make this work both ways. If you didn't already see where this was going, this was part one of the classic think, pair, share. So if we advance to the next slide. So for those of you here in the room, we'd like you to pair up or group up with 2 or 3 folks. Ideally, folks you don't yet know. So if you came with a friend, like turn away from your friend. Some of you may have to change a seat for a moment, but I want you to introduce yourself briefly and share some of these things you wrote about. See where you fall in line with other folks' experiences and where your experiences might diverge.
And online, we'll be doing that in our old classic breakout rooms, which are going to be open right now.
And we'll let you know when to.
To get students to actually do the readings so that we do have some kind of basis to build on. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But we wanted to just kind of start our presentation by discussing some of the purposes of text-based discussion. First, generally to activate student knowledge. Learning is basically making connections between knowledge students already have and new knowledge. So discussions are kind of where that happens. That can take place in terms of building connections with other texts or other course concepts. That can take place in terms of processing professional and personal connections. In all 3 of those situations, basically, the discussion is where the learning is happening. And a well-cultivated discussion is going to make learning, hopefully, happen more effectively. Another important use of text-based discussion is as formative assessment. So in this case, hopefully learning is happening, but then the purpose of the discussion is for the instructor to observe learning happening and to get an idea of what learning is happening, of what stage students are in their learning process so that the instructor can tailor future activities to better meet students' needs. As we're doing discussions, it's really important to use varied discussion techniques. So it's, if there's a certain structure that seems to work well for a class, great, but it's great also to have some novelty and some variety that serves to increase student engagement and interest. It helps create a more inclusive and equitable classroom because you'll reach different students in different ways and you'll allow students to tap into their different strengths. Sometimes the different realities of each text necessitate different types of discussion activities just based on the text types, and will work better with different types of discussions. So if we're really purposeful about selecting an interesting discussion format, we should think about what works best with the different texts that we're using. And then lastly, using different strategies helps students engage with the text in different ways and just approach the course material in different ways. So Chuck had all the answers to you guys that were talking about how to get students to do the reading. So I think he would do better at this, but I'll do my best. So the big question, of course, is what if you have this great discussion planned and then students arrive and they haven't done the reading? Well, the truth is, if you continue doing discussions in class, students will see, oh, I need to have done the reading to be able to participate in the discussion. So it's a little bit of kind of a chicken and the egg situation. But really, we would suggest reframing the question, not as what if students aren't doing the reading, to why aren't
Tabitha,
they reading. Hi there.
we're back.
Great.
We've been here.
Have you
So
been
I can
hearing
take
us?
over.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
take over.
back to the previous slide.
Yeah.
I have a shtick. Okay. So, as you're talking about these successful and less successful discussions, I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, what if the students aren't doing the reading? Important question. But I think that's not the real question, that we should reframe the question to. Slide. Why aren't students doing the reading? And how can we get them to understand the value and purpose? I'm going to try to be quick about this since we're short on time, but I will say this is a question that has been taken up for literally decades by certainly the composition and rhetoric field and possibly also education as to sort of motivations for reading and reading habits among students. And one of the undeniable themes that emerges from all this research that I've had the occasion to dip my feet into over the years is that students, because they either are or perceive themselves to be overburdened, they will prioritize. Makes sense. When it comes to course readings, the number one deciding factor about prioritizing them is whether or not they see a high grade weight attached to it directly. So they will prioritize readings that they know they're either going to be tested on in a high points exam, or they'll have to write about or use in a high points paper or project. Maybe they'll prioritize readings if they know they're going to be quiz, like something low stakes, like a quiz or a discussion board. And if they don't see any grade value, they won't do it. And the problem is, we understand that even if something we assign isn't going to be tested or quizzed or written about, it still has value that indirectly helps them with those larger projects. And so what I think we need to do is get students to understand that. And the simplest way to do that is to, as with so many other things in teaching, be explicit, be transparent. Students can't know what we don't tell them. So, next slide. You want to be explicit about the readings. They should know why they're reading something. And not just why, but why for this day. Why are you reading this for the 5th day of the semester, the 12th day of the semester? You can do this by framing it the class before. You can do it on your syllabus. I, for example, on my Canvas module or Canvas site have modules for each week. And while I have the overarching schedule of classes that just succinctly lists everything on the modules, I can say, for Tuesday, you're reading article X by author Y. As you read it, think about how she does this and that. Think about how it relates back to last week's reading. So I give them some context. What role does it play in the course? Even something as simple as saying, well, it's content. Well, content takes many forms. Are these theoretical ideas they need in order to go further? Are these methodologies you want them to apply? Examples you want them to analyze? How are you going to use it in class? They should know what they can expect about the approach you're going to take when they finish reading it. And how do you expect, and this is the important one, how do you expect them to use it in their own work? So if you aren't going to be testing them or making them write about it, what is the way in which you want this to manifest? So for example, I teach mostly writing classes, and one large bucket of readings in my classes are models. We read various types of articles and essays to analyze them to see how the writers have done the work they do. And this flummoxes students because they're not used to reading things they're not going to be tested on, because I don't test them on these readings. They're not going to write about them. But what I want is to see evidence that they have looked at these articles, looked at these essays, parsed some of the writing choices and moves, and adapted and applied them in their own work. So when I explain that to them, I think it helps them understand better why I'm asking them to read this seemingly random article that they're never going to have to sort of know in terms of its content, but they are going to have to demonstrate that they've learned from it certain writing and research techniques. So being explicit is important. And being explicit, what I love about explicit teaching is it's good for you as well as the students. Because when you're forced to articulate for your students why you're doing something, you have to articulate it for yourself. And those readings you assign every semester on autopilot, you suddenly, well, why am I assigning this article? What do I want them to get out of this? And then that in turn, to go back to Tabitha's points about the different texts and different purposes leading to different forms of discussion, can help you decide how best to use it in the classroom. There are some that are better for full class or small group. There are some that are better for more creative discussions and some that are better for more straightforward ones. And so being explicit helps both them and you to make the readings more meaningful. So even the ones that aren't going to be attached to high weight grades can be seen as meaningful. You're never going to get all of them to read everything, but you can at least plug some of the holes in the ship. So next, we should probably, oh, you have one more slide, sorry.
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention briefly, this could be a whole separate session, but the success of discussions in class, including text-based discussions, are really built on a foundation of having a safe class environment. So it's really important to take time to set norms for class discussions and for class engagement, ideally collaboratively with students. So what I do in one of my classes is I actually use pretty much those same questions that you guys used in the right pair share. I have students think about good discussions they've been a part of and bad discussions they've been a part of, and use those questions as a jumping off point for them to, in small groups, make a list of some norms for discussion that then we kind of whittle down to be class norms. I do that on the first day of class, and then we return to it about week 5 or 6 to revise them and just check in. It's also really important to build community at the beginning of the semester. So at the beginning of the semester, start with more accessible discussions that are not personally sensitive, discussions that are just going to be easy for students to get involved with and start to get to know each other, so that as the semester continues, you can dig into a little bit more challenging discussions. It's also important to model experimentations with ideas, especially if you as a professor make a mistake. That's a great opportunity to say, okay, so here's what I said in class last week. As I was thinking more, I realized actually, whatever it was that you realized. And when you are discussing anything sensitive, any topics that could be especially difficult for students, it's important to prepare them for those discussions ahead of time. Discuss together what they should do if they feel uncomfortable, discuss together what they should do if they feel that somebody else has said something inappropriate, and just handle those discussions carefully. All right, and now we are actually going to, hopefully, we are going to have time to model a couple of these. But first, we need to give you guys your reading. We don't have a lot of time, but we are going to give you guys about 3 minutes to skim over the Teaching Tools Active Learning Library. Frankly, if all you get out of this presentation is the Teaching Tools Active Learning Library, you're going to be doing great, because this is a great resource. It's basically a few dozen discussion strategies that are explained really clearly and that have some links to further resources so you can learn more about them. So you can either access it through the URL. It's real easy to type teaching.tools/activities. I'll share that in the chat for you in the Zoom, or it's really easily accessible through mobile if you want to use that QR code. We'll give you a few minutes to look over that site and think about those 4 questions on the screen here. All right, that has been just about 3 minutes. Like your students, you didn't have enough time to do the full reading, but that'll be fine. So what we'd like to do now is first model a tech-based discussion about that reading. We all got really good at these tech-based discussions during the pandemic, but they have a lot of utility both for online classes and in-person classes. So what we're going to do is we're going to show how you could do a tech-based discussion on a Padlet. So the Padlet is accessible through the link. It's easy to type bit.ly/AFC701, or it's also pretty easy to access through mobile. So what we would like you guys to do, actually, I'm going to switch over there in a moment. But what we'd like you to do is post at least once in response to one of those discussion questions that were posted on the previous slide. We already have one post over there. And for those of you in the Zoom room, the link is in the chat. All right, so we have quite a few responses in the chat now. I'm going to switch over to that screen. So we have a lot of people saying exit ticket, case studies, media example, reading quizzes. These are all familiar. Think, Pair, Share is familiar. Some new activities include snowball discussion, jigsaw discussion, muddiest point. Nobody has any questions. Great, we've been crystal clear. Just kidding. You can read the resources about them all later on. People hoping to try case study, 3-2-1, jigsaw. A lot of interest in 3-2-1, so that might be one that people should take a look at. So once you've done the Jamboard or the Padlet with students, you have this as a resource. It's kind of like the think part of the Think, Pair, Share. So you have a little bit of thinking out in public on the Padlet. And now this is sort of the foundation for the continued discussion. So it might be that you say, okay, why are you interested in trying 3-2-1? What's, if muddiest point is new to you, what do you think will be challenging about that activity in your classes? So this can be the foundation for a more in-depth discussion. So in addition to the, yeah.
For one example of how this might work with students, I have not used this app, but I've used Jamboard for similar purposes. You can ask the question, what was the moment that gave you the most trouble in the text? I believe that's muddiest point. And then they put those up on and you can look at where did people tend to be confused? Where did people tend to, or the opposite? What was the most insightful or interesting new point you gained from the reading? And you can cluster them together and see where people tended to gravitate, and that can then inform the rest of your discussion.
Yeah, so any of these tech options can actually kind of be the host for any of those activities on the teaching tools library. So Padlet is a tool that we just used. Other options, as Chuck mentioned, include Jamboard, Menti, Pull Everywhere. Or if you're in Zoom, the Zoom chat is a great way to get students participating. If you didn't know, now there's also a Canvas chat option, which is great because I was really missing being able to just say, share your ideas in the chat once we were in person. So part of, for me, the challenge to pivoting back to in person is thinking like, okay, how do I do that activity that I figured out how to do online back in person? And often it's just as simple as for that Padlet, I could write those questions across the top of a whiteboard. And so I've started coming to class with like 20 whiteboard markers so that a bunch of students can go up to the front of the room and write their answers and kind of repurpose these different tech tools for in-person, old-fashioned use, to give us just the beginnings of a discussion. Chuck has another way that he does this, and he's going to share about that now.
Given the constraints of time, I'll go through this very quickly and make a shameless pitch. The latest issue of the CTRL Beat includes an article I wrote about using Google Docs in my classroom. So more details can be found there. But I use Google Docs a lot in my classes for discussions. So what I'll do is I will create a doc at the beginning of the semester for each of my classes that they all have editing access to. I link it to Canvas, both on the home page and each week's module, and we use it for lots of different activities. So what we'll do is I'll put them into groups. Sometimes physically they'll come together and work around one screen. Sometimes I'll put them into groups and they'll work remotely on the same page of the doc. Depends on what I want to get out of the reading. And they will record. One person usually will record what the group is doing unless they're doing it remotely. And what I like about this is it's lower stakes, like so many other group activities, and doing it on the computer somehow seems to like minimize some of the stress for some of the quieter students, because it feels less like you're talking to the group when you're doing it. They're so much used to like digital communication anyway. We all hate that moment when you have dynamic discussions going and then you say, okay, every group report out, and the energy just drains out of the room. You don't have to do that because everyone can just scroll through the Google Doc and read what everyone else has typed. You can observe it as the teacher without hovering. You can just on your own computer. And I like to sometimes add comments when I see they're getting close to an idea. I can make a comment and push them a little further or raise a question. And it's not like me sort of intruding physically into their group. And it leaves a record. So students who are absent can get a sense of the results of the discussion. Students can go back and review it. And I use it for lots of different things. And in the interest of time, I'll collapse this. A lot of you mentioned the idea of a jigsaw being something that you're interested in trying. I love jigsaws. I use those a lot. And I use Google Docs a lot for them. So if you go to the next slide, I've copied a piece of this past fall's group work Google Doc for my complex problem seminar, which is about fantastical storytelling. And early in the semester, we work with myth. And so on one day, I've assigned them to read a cluster of hero myths from various cultures, put them into groups, assign each group a myth, and they go to this page. Toby, Audrey, and Liam had to answer questions about Water Jar Boy, which is a great Tewa myth, and answer some questions. And they all do this on their own page. Then I shuffle the groups so that there are representatives from the different myths. They go back and look at this from each group, A through E or however many they are. And then on the next slide is an example of the next page where they have to synthesize. And so they have to look at what each group has written in the previous part of the discussion and come up with new ideas based on just that record. And so it's practicing analysis and synthesis. And again, it keeps a record. And we are just about out of time. So we have a couple of other things we wanted to show you, but you can get information about those on that wonderful Teaching Tools website. We would just like you to do one last demo and do an exit tweet. So you can either do this in person by leaving it as a Post-it. I have Post-its. Index cards and Post-its, two essential tools in my classroom. Or if you're online, you can post in the chat. And if you've ever done a chat waterfall, when everyone sort of posts at the same time, and any sort of thing you took away from the presentation, and we can leave them if it works. Not all walls are Post-it friendly. To leave, you can grab one and peel them off. And this could be a great tool because you have a physical record and everyone can see kind of what everyone else has said. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no problem. So the benefit of doing this as a tweet is that it emphasizes that students are just being cohesive, or being rather concise and sharing an overview. So they can use hashtags to kind of connect to other knowledge. They can use abbreviations to condense their ideas. Either on a Post-it or on like a short tweet in a chat is a good way to do this, and just get students to share an overall impression of what they've taken away from class at the end. Gives them a little summary of what they've learned.
Exactly. And then of course you can gather those, and depending on what they reveal, that can be where you start on the next class. It informs what you do in the next time you meet.
All right. So if you're able to share that in the chat, we'll really appreciate appreciate it. Otherwise, if you just post it as you're on your way out of the room, that'll be great. Thank you, everybody, for your patience today. I'll share the PDF of the slides in the chat right now. We'll also be able to post that on the CTRL website. And we thank you guys so much for joining us.
And please, if you have questions, you can reach out. We're happy